Women's professional soccer is on the rise in the Queen City. Carolina Ascent FC's inaugural season continues on Saturday, April 12th. Be there for every victory. Be here for every goal. Be here for world-class women's professional soccer. Tickets are on sale now and starting at just $22. Visit CarolinaAscent.com to secure your seats and join the climb.
Tired of looking at your old floors? The solution? 50 Floor, the ultimate flooring experience. Schedule a free in-home consultation and see hundreds of samples right in your home of the highest quality hardwood, carpet, laminate, and luxury vinyl. All with the best warranties in the industry and an industry-best price match guarantee. Save thousands by booking an appointment and mention promo code PODCAST and get $500 off your flooring and materials plus free installation. Call 877-50-FLOOR or visit us online at 50floor.com.
Women's professional soccer is on the rise in the Queen City. Carolina Ascent FC's inaugural season continues Saturday, April 12th at 7 p.m. Tickets start at $26. Visit CarolinaAscent.com/tickets to secure your seats and join the climb.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. In our last episode, we examined Kilwa's rise to its ultimate height, before changing global economic tides brought the powerful city crashing down. While Kilwa remained an important city, the global economic crisis of the 14th century, caused by global temperature declines, the end of the Pax Mongolica in Asia, and the devastating rise of the Black Death, ultimately ended up with the city-state losing much of its economic status. Today, Kilwa begins the long road of recovery, as the state attempts to reassert itself in the aftermath of the crisis-laden 14th century. Season 6, Episode 13, The Stone City of Songo Mnara. As we explored in the last episode, even before the economic slowdown that came with the global outbreak of the Black Death, Ibn Battuta's account of Kilwa gave us some hints of an economic downturn taking place right at the end of the reign of Al-Mawahib. He mentions an increase in raids on the mainland and a decline in the once overwhelming generosity of the Sultan's government. Archaeology, too, seems to support the suggestion of an economic downturn, with the royal palace not being completed, and with the collapse of the mosque's dome remaining unrepaired. There were also some changes that were left unmentioned in the last episode. I haven't brought it up yet because I didn't really find the right place to mention it, but Kilwa features an elaborate set of mausoleums and tombs, known as the Cemetery of the Kilwa Sultans. These tombs, which range from the late 13th to mid-14th century, reached their zenith in complexity and intricacy during the first decades of the 14th. In addition to complex forms built out of coral limestone, characteristic of Kilwa's architecture, the cemetery during the zenith also features some more intricate imported materials as well. The most interesting among them, in my view, is a marble slab. What makes it so neat is that it comes from the Gujarat region of India. It is extremely interesting even in isolation, but even more so when you consider that its general composition looks like that of an architectural feature of a Hindu temple, while its fringes are inscribed with Quranic verses and geometric iconography mimicking the appearance of lanterns, which are a comic motif in Indian Islamic art. In India during this period, it was very common for Hindu and Muslim kingdoms to desecrate each other's temples and mosques. As we've seen with Kilwa and the entirety of human history, places of worship can often become an important symbol of the king or kingdom who constructed it and their authority, and are therefore a common target of desecration. On the other hand, it was also common for the temples and mosques of one religion to be converted into another and facelifted, while retaining much of the original architecture. The mixed messaging on this marble slab from India implies that it might have had a lot of stories to tell in this regard, perhaps being from a temple that was converted into a mosque, hence the combination of Islamic and Hindu motifs. Maybe that same building was later desecrated during a rebellion, or to show authority over a local prince, or to showcase the conquest of a new territory by a new empire. Or perhaps it was just desecrated in the first place, and that these later motifs were added later to be sold for scrap across the ocean. The marble slab, which would have been heavy and expensive to transport, is a testament to the wealth and international reach that Kilwa possessed at the time, while the intricate carving attests to the type of craftsmanship that Kilwa's nobility could call on from both the foreign markets and domestically. This has to be one of those moments in history where I just wish that I could, speak the language of stone, where I could communicate with that stone and hear the endless stories that it could tell. To be candid, I actually wanted to bring this up in the last episode because it was such a cool artifact, but I kind of just forgot to include a mention of this really neat and imported mausoleum trim, so yeah, glad I was able to fit it in here. But while that mausoleum trim certainly told a story of wealth and opulence, it didn't last. As time went on, in the cemetery of the Kilwa Sultans grew simpler and simpler before they generally stopped being constructed as a whole. People would continue to be buried there, but we sadly know very little about them because their graves were largely unmarked or quite small. Anyways, by the end of the 14th century, it would seem like those glory days of the past were long gone. This period is largely absent from the historical record, as the Kilwa Chronicle pays very little attention, as do foreign geographers. We return to the period of rulers being described with one or two sentences in the Chronicle. They continue to emphasize the same things we saw with Ibn Battuta's writing, including an increased importance of the martial side of rulership. Especially in the second half of the 14th century, we see a remarkable increase in the number of rulers that are listed as being overthrown in a rebellion or killed in battle with the people of the mainland. It might not be too big a surprise then that around the same time, many of the wealthy and powerful people of Kilwa likely started scoping out plans for a different place to live. Kilwa was beginning to enter into a brief period of medieval urban decay. Around the same time that Kilwa's wealth and prosperity were starting to slip, another nearby city was experiencing an equivalent rise. Located just across a small strait to the south of Kilwa Kisiwani, the tidal island of Songo Mnara was experiencing the 14th century in a very different way from its neighbor. When Kilwa was shrinking, Songo Mnara was growing. Like I mentioned a few episodes ago, the settlement of Songo Mnara had likely already existed for a few centuries at this point, but was quite small, and not especially developed compared to the urban landscape of Kilwa Kisiwani. However, in terms of large-scale occupation, the island's true flourishing began in the late 14th century. The settlement on the island began to rapidly expand to include several enormous houses, some of which featured dozens of individual rooms. These houses, built primarily out of the same type of Portuguese coral used in Kilwa, are substantially larger than their Kilwa equivalents from this period and even from the other more prosperous periods. Even the smallest buildings on the island usually feature at least 5 rooms, while the largest stand out as far grander, with the very biggest featuring upwards of 40 distinct rooms each.
Women's professional soccer is on the rise in the Queen City. Carolina Ascent FC's inaugural season continues Saturday, April 12th at 7 p.m. Tickets start at $26. Visit carolinaascent.com/tickets to secure your seats and join the climb.
These large buildings were likely the homes of the very wealthiest families of Songo Mnara, while the smaller buildings were likely the residences of the working population. However, even this isn't especially clear, as the small and tightly knit ensuite layout of the design features rooms of a similar scale to those found in the smaller houses, often surrounding a single, larger common area. It arguably resembles the layout of an ancient one-story apartment complex, although this is more likely just a consequence of the communal, family-based nature of living, rather than the implication of multifamily housing. Families in the Swahili coast during this time were likely extended, and so wealthier families with more resources could afford to live together in a big 40-room house. The town is laid out in a really interesting way otherwise, with clusters of houses being built in close proximity and density to each other, and wrapping around itself to form something of a semicircle. Meanwhile, there is a lot less density around the center. Instead, the center is filled with a collection of more loosely spread houses, as well as unbuilt spaces and cemeteries between them. However, while most of the settlement seems to correspond pretty well with other coastal Swahili settlements, the most unique feature of the settlement is its outer wall. See, shockingly few Swahili settlements have any sort of walls around their perimeter. And it's kind of weird that Songo Mnara does. The city also featured a large 3-story tall tower, which was also somewhat unusual in the area. There were plenty of multi-story buildings along the Swahili coast, but they were primarily related to mosques and especially minarets. This one probably wasn't. In fact, the city's name, Songo Mnara, is a name derived from later periods and is most likely not what the people living there called it at the time. The name literally derives from the Kiswahili word Mnara, or tower, meaning that the name translates pretty much to the Tower of Songo, and later nearby residents who visited the by then ruined town began to refer to the town collectively by the feature that stood out to them the most, this big, impressive tower. We're not exactly sure what the tower was used for, although most of the guests seem to indicate that it was probably a kiln that also doubled as something of a local watchtower. It's a really interesting structure. Of course, the presence of these defensive-oriented constructions seems to indicate that the city was quite wary of its security, which makes sense considering that, unlike Kilwa, it was only on a tidal island, and was connected to the mainland as a peninsula during low tide. This would leave it vulnerable to raids or attacks from the mainland. It shouldn't be too surprising that this was a concern. After all, the raiding of nearby communities had become a major part of Kilwa's economy during the downturn of the 14th century. It would follow that they weren't the only ones with the idea, and that raiding as a whole became a bigger concern than in previous generations across East Africa. Who knows, maybe some of those people that Kilwa were raiding wanted revenge. And Songo Mnara, partially connected to the mainland, would have made a treasured spot. The settlement of Songo Mnara, which just at the beginning of the 14th century barely even existed at all, peaked at a population of likely almost 1,000 at the end of the century.
Tired of looking at your old floors? The solution? 50 Floor, the ultimate flooring experience. Schedule a free in-home consultation and see hundreds of samples right in your home of the highest quality hardwood, carpet, laminate, and luxury vinyl. All with the best warranties in the industry and an industry best price match guarantee. Save thousands by booking an appointment and mention promo code PODCAST and get $500 off your flooring and materials plus free installation. Call 877-50-FLOOR or visit us online at 50floor.com.
All on an island of less than 3 square miles. This is actually pretty dense for the standards of the time and is actually still fairly dense even today, being comparable in density to quite a few different suburbs around the world. For the small population, it really says a lot that Songo Mnara still found a way to feature 5 distinct mosques. This high density of mosques really showcases just how important their Islamic religion had become to the people of the East African coast. However, apart from this, Songo Mnara remains a fairly enigmatic site. It's not mentioned in the Kilwa Chronicle one way or another, and the conditions of its foundation, growth, and relationship with Kilwa are still something of a mystery. Large hordes of coins from Kilwa, as well as the similarity of the town's architecture and urban planning, as well as the incredibly close proximity between the two settlements, most likely indicate that the area was a colony of Kilwa, and under the direct or indirect supervision of the Sultan. But beyond that, it's really hard to say much. The simplest explanation for Songo Mnara's initial expansion is that it had become a home for wealthy members of Kilwa society. It was a place for them to put some distance between themselves and the political and economic instability of Kilwa Kisiwani in the 14th century. It's actually quite fitting that I compared it to the density of a suburb, because it kind of was a suburb. However, while that was most likely the initial reason for Songo Mnara's rise as a settlement, it's worth noting that the settlement's growth continued even after things in Kilwa began to stabilize and turn around. See, Kilwa's economic downturn couldn't last forever, and by the end of the 14th century and start of the 15th, there were some signs that the fortune of Kilwa were finally turning for the better again. Construction accelerated once again in Kilwa around the 1420s, and by that time, the long-abandoned and ruined Great Mosque was finally reconstructed to its former glory. The copper coins being minted in Kilwa became more abundant, while silver coins, long extinct at this time, re-emerged. What exactly was behind the cause of Kilwa's economic recovery is, like pretty much everything else about this period, not super clear. However, the most likely explanation lies with the same factor which caused the economic slowdown for Kilwa in the first place: global gold prices. Of course, like we talked about last time, several major factors had conspired to wreck the global economy in the 14th century, such as the collapse of inland trade in Asia following the end of the Pax Mongolica, shifts in global climate, and the Black Death pandemic. This really hurt Kilwa's economy, as the global slowdown in trade not only hurt their status as trade middlemen, but it also caused a decline in demand for their most useful product: gold. Kilwa's most valuable export was gold, of course, through its control of the port of Sofala, the gate to the important gold mines of modern Zimbabwe. However, as the global economy slowly began to adjust and normalize, a new crisis would take form. But this time, while the crisis affected everyone else, it would end up being one of the great elements of Kilwa's recovery. The exact time that this crisis truly started is widely debated, but is generally identified as having its roots around the turn of the 14th to the 15th century. Its causes, too, are not especially transparent, but its effects were certainly felt. Around this time, as the economies of the world slowly recovered from the aftermath of the Black Death, a new economic trend emerged. Now, this is going to go really off course, but trust me that this economic context matters in Kilwa's history. I'm going to be getting a bit out of my wheelhouse too, so if I sound less confident in this section, just know that I'm kind of treading on foreign ground here, literally and figuratively. So, during this time period, if you examined the economies of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, there was a clear trend that had existed for quite a while. When it came to trade between the regions, the kingdoms of Europe generally imported a lot more from Asia than they exported. Silks, spice, incense, porcelain, and all sorts of other Eastern goodies were consumed en masse in Europe. Of course, European merchants had to trade something for these goods, and they typically did so in silver. Now, throughout most of the Middle Ages, this wasn't really a big deal. Silver was in constantly high demand for merchants in the Middle East, since it could be used to facilitate further trade with South and Southeast Asia, and as a substitute for the ever-scarce gold. In previous eras, the kingdoms of Europe had large enough quantities of gold and silver being constantly mined to make this trade imbalance not a huge deal. However, that wouldn't last forever. Labor shortages following the plague, as well as major depletions of several gold mines simultaneously in Europe, forced gold and silver to suddenly become extremely short in supply. Mints across Europe began to shut down one by one, and by the 1450s, few kingdoms in Europe still even minted silver or especially gold coins at all. Instead, they relied heavily on bartering or creating new improvised currencies, which were largely things like silks and spices, further increasing their trade imbalance with Asia. Now, in Europe, this crisis was known as the bullion famine, and more globally, we tend to use the term 15th century currency crisis. This crisis was arguably not very good for the Middle East, and was pretty dang bad for Europe. However, it was quite the opposite for Kilwa. With the importation of gold and silver from Europe declining immensely, Middle Eastern and Asian kingdoms now had to rely on purchasing gold from other places, and were willing to do so at a much higher price. For gold exporting states like Kilwa, the currency crisis was in fact an economic miracle. Now, I want to stress that Kilwa was far from a one-resource economy, and it profited off of more than just being a middleman in the gold trade. However, it is undeniable that gold prices played a major role in determining the extent to which Kilwa would or would not prosper. And in the age of the bullion famine, oh yeah, Kilwa was doing well. However, even as Kilwa's economy began to recover at the turn of the 15th century, the settlement at Songo Mnara actually didn't shrink and continued to grow in size and scale. This probably means that the nearby settlement was, although maybe initially created due to instability and decline in Kilwa, a place that had other advantages going for it. Even as Kilwa was recovering, there was still a reason to live in Songo Mnara. Perhaps its location as a southern port of departure was useful in slightly shortening the voyages to Sofala, or Perhaps it was simply yet another inevitable expansion as Kilwa's population grew ever dense. Kilwa's peak population around this time ranges wildly from 8,000 to as high as 15,000. And when you consider that it was on an island of less than 5 square miles of area, this was extremely dense by the standards of the time. If Songo Mnara had a density similar to a suburb, Kilwa's population density reached over 1,000 people per square mile, and this would still be considered fairly high density for a city today, especially in the era's context, and even more so in a region like East Africa, usually defined by its rurality. The creation and continued growth of Songo Mnara may have been simply an example of urban sprawl, and one that would only continue as Kilwa recovered its status. However, while Kilwa's economic fortunes were turning for the better at this time, money can't quite solve everything, now can it? Join us for our next episode as Kilwa, despite its economy recovering, enters into its worst period of political instability we've yet to see, with the power of the monarchy itself coming under threat for the first time. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Iofagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, Bibi Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Nwakocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabodike, Kwajo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badu, Ghassan Firjiani, Kitty, Mac T, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Tariq Beetleman, Yannick Bulnett, and Shixnay Brennan, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.
Women's professional soccer is on the rise in the Queen City. Carolina Ascent FC's inaugural season continues on Saturday, April 12th. Be there for every victory. Be here for every goal. Be here for world-class women's professional soccer. Tickets are on sale now and starting at just $22. Visit CarolinaAscent.com to secure your seats and join the climb.
If you or a loved one have been a victim of crime, the North Carolina Department of Public Safety Office of Victim Compensation Services provides programs to help you find peace of mind. We're here to help you apply for benefits that you may qualify for to recover from hardships such as lost wages and medical expenses. To learn more, visit ncdps.gov/4victims. That's ncdps.gov/4victims.
Struggling to keep up with your diabetes care? US Med is here to help.
They handle my insurance, deliver my supplies, and keep me updated with the latest tech. No hassle.
US Med, diabetes care made simple. Visit usmed.com/easy or call 888-713-1557 today.